Henry thought the college reunion would be a few hours of small talk and awkward handshakes. He never expected his ex-wife to stand in the center of the room, smiling at their former classmates while calling him a failed husband and a useless father. Laughter rippled through the crowd. He stood frozen. A black, single dad with no defense, no rebuttal, just silence. Then, at the exact moment his humiliation peaked, a woman walked toward him. She was elegant, powerful, and utterly calm. She slipped her arm through his and said one word. "Honey, who was she, and why was she on his side?" Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below, and if you're new here and enjoy stories about real life, dignity, and unexpected moments that change everything, hit that subscribe button and join our community. Now, let's get back to Henry. The evening sun cast long shadows across the living room as Henry adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror. Behind him, 7-year-old Serena sat cross-legged on the couch, watching her father with curious eyes. "Daddy, why are you dressed so fancy?" Henry turned to face his daughter. "Remember I told you about my college friends? We're having a little party tonight." Serena tilted her head. "But you never go to parties. You always stay home with me." She was right. In the 3 years since the divorce, Henry had built his life around 2 things: his job as a mid-level manager at a financial firm and his daughter. Weekends meant trips to the park, not nights out. Evenings meant bedtime stories, not social events. He had declined every invitation, every opportunity to reconnect with old friends because being present for Serena mattered more than anything else. "Your grandmother thinks I need to get out more," Henry said, kneeling down to meet Serena's eyes. "And maybe she's right. Just this once." Serena considered this for a moment, then nodded with the seriousness only a child could muster. "Okay, but you have to promise to come back and read me a story." "I promise, baby girl. I'll be home before you know it." His mother, Ruth, appeared in the doorway. At 62, she carried herself with the quiet strength of a woman who had raised 3 children on her own after her husband passed. She looked at Henry with knowing eyes. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone tonight," she said. "Remember that." Henry kissed Serena's forehead, grabbed his car keys, and headed out into the cooling night air. His mother's words echoed in his mind as he drove toward the restaurant. He had spent his whole life not trying to prove anything. He worked hard, kept his head down, and focused on what mattered. But somehow the world always seemed to demand more from men who looked like him. The restaurant was upscale, the kind of place with white tablecloths and soft jazz playing in the background. Henry arrived 15 minutes late, having circled the block twice while debating whether to just turn around and go home. When he finally walked through the door, he immediately felt out of place. Groups of his former classmates clustered around the bar and scattered tables, their laughter filling the room. Some had grown prosperous, their success evident in tailored suits and expensive watches. Others looked tired, worn down by the years. Henry recognized a few faces, but found himself gravitating toward the edges of the room, nursing a glass of water and exchanging polite nods with people he barely remembered. Then he saw her. Ellie stood near the center of the room, holding a glass of champagne and commanding attention the way she always had, even after 3 years. The sight of his ex-wife sent a complicated mixture of emotions through his chest. She was beautiful, confident, and completely at ease. Beside her stood a tall white man in an expensive suit, his arm draped possessively around her waist. Her new husband, Henry realized. The one she had married less than a year after their divorce was finalized. For a moment, Henry considered leaving. He could slip out the door, drive home, and read Serena her bedtime story. No one would notice. No one would care. But before he could move, Ellie's eyes found his across the room. Her smile widened, but there was something sharp in it, something that made Henry's stomach tighten. "Henry!" she called out, her voice carrying over the ambient noise. "Everyone, look who finally showed up!" Heads turned. People he hadn't spoken to in years suddenly focused their attention on him. Henry forced a polite smile and raised his hand in a small wave, hoping that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Ellie detached herself from her husband and glided toward Henry, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. A small crowd followed, drawn by her energy and the promise of entertainment. "It's been so long," Ellie said, stopping a few feet away from him. "I was just telling everyone about the old days. You know, back when we were married." The way she said married made it sound like a joke, like a youthful mistake that everyone should laugh about. A few people chuckled nervously. "Ellie," Henry said, keeping his voice neutral. "You look well." "I am well," she replied, gesturing toward her husband, who had joined the growing circle. "Richard has been wonderful. He actually takes me on vacations. Can you believe it? We just got back from the Maldives." More laughter from the crowd. Henry said nothing. Ellie's smile never wavered, but her eyes grew harder. "I was just telling Sarah here about how things were between us. How you were always working, never present. Remember how you used to come home and just sit in front of the TV? I practically raised Serena by myself those first few years." Henry felt the heat rising in his chest, but he kept his expression calm. This was a trap, and he knew it. Ellie had always been skilled at rewriting history, at painting herself as the victim in a story where the truth was far more complicated. "That's not how I remember it," he said quietly. Ellie laughed, a bright, brittle sound. "Of course you don't. You were never paying attention." She turned to address the crowd, her voice rising. "Did you know he's a single dad now, raising Serena all by himself? I give him credit for trying. I really do. But some people just aren't cut out for it." The words hit Henry like a physical blow. He saw the way people looked at him, saw the mixture of pity and judgment in their eyes. A few exchanged glances that said everything without speaking a word. A black man who couldn't keep his family together. A father playing a role he wasn't equipped for. "Ellie," Richard said, placing a hand on his wife's shoulder. "Maybe we should. I'm just being honest." Ellie interrupted, shaking off his touch. "Someone has to be." Henry never could stand up for himself. That was always the problem. No ambition, no drive, just existing day after day while I did all the heavy lifting. Henry's jaw tightened. He could defend himself. He could tell everyone how Ellie had been the one to walk out. How she had left him with a 4-year-old daughter and a stack of divorce papers. He could explain how he had fought for custody. How the judge had sided with him because Ellie couldn't be bothered to show up for the hearings. He could say all of that. But he didn't, because he knew how it would look. A black man arguing with his ex-wife in public, raising his voice, showing emotion. He had spent his entire life avoiding that stereotype, refusing to give anyone a reason to see him as the angry black man they expected him to be. So he stayed silent even as Ellie's words cut deeper with each passing second. "See?" Ellie said, gesturing at him with her champagne glass. "Nothing to say. Just like always." "You know what your problem is? Henry, you think being quiet makes you noble, but it doesn't. It just makes you weak." The room had grown uncomfortably silent. People shifted on their feet, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch the spectacle unfold. Henry felt the weight of their stares, felt himself shrinking under the collective judgment of people he hadn't seen in over a decade. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from Serena. "Daddy, when are you coming home? I miss you." Something cracked inside him. Here he was, standing in a room full of strangers being humiliated by a woman who had abandoned their daughter while that same daughter waited at home for a bedtime story. What was he doing here? What was he trying to prove? Henry put his phone away and took a step toward the door. "There he goes," Ellie announced to the room, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Running away. That's what he does best. That's why I had to leave him." He stopped. His back was to the crowd, but he could feel every eye on him. This was the moment of maximum humiliation, the point where anything he did would be wrong. Turn around and fight, and he's the angry black man. Walk away, and he's the coward who couldn't face his own failures. Stay silent, and he admits to everything Ellie accused him of. For 3 long seconds, Henry stood frozen, caught between impossible choices. Then a voice cut through the silence. A woman's voice, calm and authoritative, coming from the entrance behind him. "Honey, I'm so sorry I'm late." The meeting ran longer than expected. Henry turned around slowly, not quite believing what he had heard. A woman stood in the doorway of the restaurant, her presence commanding immediate attention. She wore a tailored charcoal dress that spoke of quiet wealth, and her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant twist. Her eyes swept across the room with the calm assessment of someone accustomed to being in charge. And when her gaze landed on Henry, she smiled warmly and walked toward him. Before Henry could say a word, she slipped her arm through his and leaned in close enough for her perfume to reach him. "I hope I didn't keep you waiting too long," she said, loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear, then softer. "Just for him. Play along." Ellie's champagne glass had frozen halfway to her lips. The smugness on her face flickered, replaced by confusion. "I'm sorry." "And you are?" The woman turned to Ellie with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Carrara Palmer. I'm a friend of Henry's." "A friend," Ellie repeated, her tone skeptical. She looked Carrara up and down, taking in the expensive dress, the understated diamond earrings, the quiet confidence that radiated from every pore. I didn't realize Henry had friends who called him honey. Carrara's smile widened slightly. "Well, there's a lot about Henry you might not know anymore. It has been 3 years, hasn't it?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Henry could feel the dynamic in the room changing, the attention that had been focused on his humiliation now redirecting toward this unexpected development. Ellie's eyes narrowed, and Henry recognized the look. She was recalculating, trying to figure out who this woman was and what threat she posed. "Henry never mentioned you," Ellie said, her voice carrying an edge. "And I thought I knew all his friends from college." "We didn't meet in college," Carrara replied smoothly. "We worked together." Richard, Ellie's husband, had been watching the exchange with growing interest. Now he stepped forward, his businessman's instincts clearly activated. "Cara Palmer," he said as if testing the name. "That sounds familiar. Have we met?" "Before?" Cara could answer. A voice called out from across the room. "Wait a minute." A man Henry vaguely recognized from his economics classes pushed through the crowd. Cara Palmer, as in the CFO of Hartwell Financial. The murmuring started immediately. Henry saw recognition dawn on several faces, including Richard's. Hartwell Financial was one of the largest investment firms on the East Coast. Its CFO would be exactly the kind of person Richard would want to impress. "Guilty as charged," Carrara said lightly, as if her position were no more significant than being a local accountant. Richard's entire demeanor changed. The possessive arm around Ellie loosened, and he stepped forward with an eager smile. "Ms. Palmer, it's an honor. I've followed Hartwell's growth for years. Your restructuring of the derivatives division was brilliant." Carrara inclined her head graciously. "Thank you. And you are Richard Thornton. I run a boutique investment firm downtown. Thornton Capital." "Ah, yes," Carrara said, her tone polite but unimpressed. "I've heard the name." The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable. Richard's smile faltered slightly, and Ellie's face had gone pale. Henry watched his ex-wife connect the dots. She had just spent 10 minutes publicly humiliating an employee of one of the most powerful women in the financial industry. Worse, that woman was now standing arm in arm with Henry, looking at Ellie like she was an insect that had landed on an otherwise pleasant dinner. "So," Ellie said, forcing brightness into her voice, "how exactly do you two know each other?" "Henry works in middle management, doesn't he?" I wouldn't think a CFO would have much reason to interact with someone at his level. The insult was clear. But Carrara seemed entirely unbothered. "Actually, Henry reports to a division head who reports to me, but I make it a point to know the people in my company, especially the ones who stand out." "Stand out?" Ellie laughed, the sound brittle. "Henry, I'm sorry, but that's hard to imagine. When we were married, he couldn't even remember our anniversary." "Ellie," Richard said quietly, placing a hand on her arm, "maybe we should." She shook him off. "No, I want to understand this because the Henry I knew was passive, uninspired, and completely incapable of taking initiative. So, what exactly makes him stand out to someone like you?" The question hung in the air around them. The other guests had formed a loose circle, watching the confrontation with barely concealed fascination. Henry felt Carrara's arm tighten slightly around his, a small gesture of reassurance. "You want to know what makes Henry stand out?" Carrara's voice remained calm, conversational, as if she were discussing quarterly reports rather than defending a man's character. "Let me tell you what I've observed over the past 3 years." She released Henry's arm and took a step toward Ellie, not aggressively, but with the quiet authority of someone who is used to commanding boardrooms. "Henry has never been late to work a single day, not once in 3 years, except for the times his daughter was sick. And on those occasions he called ahead, explained the situation, and made up every hour he missed. Do you know how rare that kind of reliability is?" Ellie opened her mouth to respond, but Kara continued without giving her the chance. "Last year, I recommended Henry for a promotion. It would have meant a significant raise and a corner office. It also would have required frequent travel." He turned it down. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ellie's eyes widened. "He turned down a promotion." "He did," Kara confirmed. "When I asked him why, he said he couldn't be away from his daughter that much. He said she needed him and no job was worth missing her childhood." She let that sink in before adding, "I've worked in finance for 20 years. I've seen men abandon their families for far less than what I offered Henry. He's the first person I've ever met who chose his child over his career without a moment's hesitation." The silence in the room was absolute. Henry stared at Carrara, stunned by her words. He had never imagined that his decision had made any impression on her at all. He had simply done what felt right, what any father should do. Ellie's composure was cracking. "That doesn't mean anything." "Plenty of people turn down promotions. It doesn't make him a good father." "You're right," Carrara said. "One decision doesn't define a person. So, let me tell you about the pattern I've noticed." She began to walk slowly around Ellie, addressing the crowd as much as the woman in front of her. "Every day at 5:45, Henry checks his phone every single day without fail. At first, I thought he was watching the markets. Then I realized he was texting someone, his daughter, I assume, because every time he puts the phone down." He's smiling. Henry felt his throat tighten. He did text Serena every evening before leaving work. He had no idea anyone had noticed. "When we have late meetings," Kara continued, "Henry stays until the work is done. He never complains, never makes excuses, but he also never stays a minute longer than necessary because he has somewhere to be, someone waiting for him." She stopped in front of Ellie and met her gaze directly. "That's the man you're calling a failure. A man who shows up every day, keeps every promise, and puts his child before everything else. If that's your definition of failure, then I think we have very different standards." Ellie's face had flushed red. Her hands trembled slightly around her champagne glass. You don't know what our marriage was like. You don't know what I went through. You're absolutely right, Carrara said. I don't know what happened between you two. And frankly, it's none of my business. But I do know what I've seen with my own eyes. And I know that standing in a room full of people and calling a single father useless and weak says more about you than it does about him. The words landed like a slap. Ellie took a step back, bumping into Richard, who steadied her with a hand on her elbow. The crowd had gone completely still, everyone waiting to see what would happen next, for a long moment. No one spoke. Then Ellie straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and forced a laugh that convinced no one. Well, this has been entertaining, but I think Richard and I should mingle with some of the other guests. It was lovely meeting you. Carrara, Henry, always a pleasure. She turned and walked away, Richard following close behind. Henry watched them go, watched Ellie's rigid posture and the way Richard leaned in to whisper something in her ear. Whatever they had, it wasn't the happiness Ellie had tried to project. The crowd began to disperse, conversations resuming in hushed tones. Henry knew he would be the subject of gossip for weeks. But somehow that didn't bother him as much as it should have. He turned to Carrara, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." Carrara shrugged. "No, I didn't. But I wanted to." "Why?" She considered the question for a moment. "Because I've sat in enough meetings to know the difference between people who talk about integrity and people who actually have it. You're one of the few people I've met who falls into the second category." A small smile crossed her face. "Also, I really don't like bullies." Henry almost laughed. "Almost? How did you even know to come here? I didn't realize you were in the same graduating class." "Different department," Kara explained. "I was in the business school. We probably crossed paths on campus. But I doubt either of us would remember. I got the reunion invitation months ago and almost threw it away. But I had a meeting downtown tonight that ended early, and I thought I'd stop by for a few minutes." She glanced toward where Ellie had disappeared into the crowd. "Good timing." "Apparently. Very good timing," Henry agreed. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the noise of the party washing over them. Then Kara tilted her head toward the door. "Do you want to get out of here? I don't know about you, but I've had enough socializing for one night." Henry thought about Serena, waiting at home for her bedtime story. He thought about his mother's words. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. He had come here tonight not knowing what he wanted. And now he realized he had gotten something he hadn't expected. Not vindication exactly. Something quieter than that. Recognition. Maybe the simple acknowledgement that he wasn't the man Ellie had described. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go." They walked out of the restaurant together, leaving behind the whispers and the stares. The night air was cool and clean after the stuffiness of the party, and Henry took a deep breath, feeling some of the tension drain from his shoulders. "I meant what I said in there," Kara said as they walked toward the parking lot. "About you turning down the promotion. I wasn't just saying that to defend you." Henry nodded slowly. "I remember that conversation. I didn't think you'd hold it against me." "Hold it against you?" Kara laughed softly. "Henry, it's one of the reasons I respect you. Do you know how many people I've seen sacrifice everything for their careers? Their marriages, their children, their health, and for what a bigger office. A fancier title." She shook her head. "You knew what mattered to you, and you didn't let anyone talk you out of it. That's rare." They reached Henry's car, and he stopped, turning to face her. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you call me honey? You could have just introduced yourself, said we were colleagues. Why the act?" Carrara's expression grew thoughtful. "Because I saw the way that room was looking at you, like you were already guilty of everything she accused you of. And I knew that if I just walked in as your boss, it wouldn't change anything. They'd still see you the same way." She met his eyes. But if they thought there was something more between us, something personal, it would make them reconsider. It would make them wonder if maybe they had misjudged you. Henry absorbed this. That's a lot of strategic thinking for a split-second decision. Kara smiled. I'm a CFO. Strategic thinking is what I do. Her smile faded slightly, replaced by something more serious. But it wasn't just strategy. When I walked in and saw you standing there with your back to everyone, I knew exactly what you were feeling. The impossibility of it. No matter what you did, they were going to judge you. You felt that before. She nodded slowly. Different circumstances. But yes, being a woman in finance, especially in the positions I've held, you learn that there's no winning sometimes. Speak up and you're aggressive. Stay quiet and you're weak. The only thing you can do is refuse to play by their rules. Henry looked at her with new understanding. I spent my whole life trying not to be the angry black man everyone expects. Tonight, I almost walked out because I didn't know how to fight back without becoming what they already thought I was. And that's exactly why I stepped in, Carrara said. Because sometimes you need someone else to speak for you. Not because you can't speak for yourself, but because the world won't listen when you do. The words settled between them, heavy with truth. Henry had spent so long being silent, being careful, being everything he thought he needed to be to survive in a world that was always ready to judge him. And here was this woman, someone he had barely known existed, who had seen through all of that in an instant. Thank you, he said again, and this time the words carried more weight. Kara reached out and touched his arm briefly. Go home to your daughter, Henry. She's waiting for you. He nodded, then hesitated. Carrara, what you did tonight, the things you said about me, they weren't just for show. Were they? She smiled, and for the first time. It reached her eyes completely. Every word was true. I just never had a reason to say them out loud before. Henry watched her walk toward her own car, a sleek black sedan parked a few spaces away. She moved with the same quiet confidence she had shown inside. But there was something different now, something more human. She had revealed a part of herself tonight, a vulnerability beneath the polished exterior. As she reached her car, Kara turned back. Henry. Yes, for what it's worth. I think your daughter is lucky to have you. Not many fathers would do what you've done. Before he could respond, she got into her car and drove away, leaving Henry standing alone in the parking lot. Above him, the stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, somewhere across town. Serena was waiting for her bedtime story, and for the first time in 3 years. Henry felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had thought. He got into his car, started the engine, and headed home. The drive home felt longer than usual. Henry kept replaying the evening in his mind, turning over each moment like stones in his palm. Ellie's accusations, the crowd's silent judgment, Carrara's unexpected intervention. He still couldn't quite believe it had happened. When he pulled into the driveway, the living room light was still on. Through the window, he could see the blue flicker of the television. His mother was probably watching one of her late-night shows, waiting up for him, even though he had told her not to. He sat in the car for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel. Something felt different, shifted. Not the world around him, but something inside. For 3 years, he had carried the weight of Ellie's departure like a stone in his chest. He had told himself it didn't matter what she thought, what anyone thought. But tonight, standing in that room while she tore him apart, he had realized how much of her voice had taken root in his own head. The doubts, the second-guessing, the constant question of whether he was enough. Kara had silenced those voices, at least for now, not by fighting Ellie, but by simply telling the truth. And somehow hearing someone else say what he had always believed about himself made it feel real in a way it never had before. Henry got out of the car and walked to the front door. When he stepped inside, his mother looked up from the couch, her reading glasses perched on her nose. "You're back earlier than I expected," Ruth said, setting down her book. It was an interesting night. She studied his face with the keen perception that had always unnerved him as a child. Interesting good or interesting bad? Henry considered the question. Both. "I think." Ruth nodded slowly, as if this answer told her everything she needed to know. "Serena tried to stay awake for you. She made it until about an hour ago, then fell asleep on the couch. I carried her to bed." Henry felt a pang of guilt. He had promised to be home in time for her bedtime story. Another promise broken. Another moment missed. But when he thought about what had happened at the reunion, he realized that maybe some things were worth the cost. "Thank you for watching her," he said. Ruth stood up and gathered her things. "That's what grandmothers are for." She stopped at the door, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Whatever happened tonight, don't let it sit too heavy on your shoulders. You're a good man, Henry, a good father. Don't let anyone make you forget that." After she left, Henry stood alone in the quiet house. The silence felt different now. Not empty, but peaceful. He walked down the hallway to Serena's room and pushed open the door. She was curled up under her purple blanket, her favorite stuffed elephant tucked under one arm. The nightlight cast soft shadows across her face, and Henry felt his heart clench with a familiar mixture of love and fear. Love for this tiny person who depended on him completely. Fear that he would somehow fail her, let her down, prove Ellie right after all. He sat down on the edge of the bed, careful not to wake her. But Serena had always been a light sleeper, and her eyes fluttered open almost immediately. "Daddy." Her voice was thick with sleep. "Hey, baby girl, I'm sorry I'm late." Serena rubbed her eyes and sat up, her hair a tangled mess around her face. "Did you have fun at your party?" Henry thought about the question. Fun wasn't the right word, but something valuable had happened, something he was still trying to understand. "It was okay," he said. "I met an old friend. A good friend." He smiled. "Yeah, a good friend." Serena yawned and snuggled back down into her pillow. "That's nice. Grandma says you need more friends." Henry laughed softly. "Grandma says a lot of things. She's usually right." Though, he couldn't argue with that. He leaned down and kissed Serena's forehead. "Go back to sleep, sweetheart. I'll be here when you wake up. Promise." The word hit him harder than it should have. How many promises had he made to this little girl? How many had he kept? He thought about what Kara had said, about how he had never missed a day of work except when Serena was sick, about how he had turned down a promotion to be present for his daughter. Maybe he wasn't perfect. Maybe he made mistakes. But he showed up. Every single day he showed up. "I promise," he said. Serena's eyes were already closing again. "I love you, Daddy. I love you too, baby girl. More than anything. More." He stayed by her bedside for a few more minutes, watching her breathe, feeling the quiet miracle of her existence. Then he stood up, turned off the nightlight, and walked back to the living room. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from an unknown number. "Did you make it home? Okay. This is Kara. By the way, I got your number from the company directory. Hope that's not too stalkerish." Henry smiled despite himself. He typed back, "Home safe. Serena's asleep. Thank you again for tonight." The response came quickly. "Stop thanking me. I meant everything I said. Get some rest, Henry. You've earned it." He stared at the message for a long moment. There was something in Carrara's words that went beyond professional courtesy, beyond simple kindness. She had seen him tonight in a way that few people ever had, not as a stereotype, not as a cautionary tale, but as a man doing his best in an impossible situation. Henry walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street. The neighborhood was dark, most of his neighbors already asleep. Somewhere out there. Ellie was probably still at the reunion, still performing for an audience that didn't really care about her. Or maybe she had gone home with Richard, back to the life she had chosen when she walked away from this one. He didn't feel angry anymore. That surprised him. For 3 years, he had carried a quiet rage toward Ellie, a resentment that he had never allowed himself to fully acknowledge. But tonight, watching her attack him with such desperation, he had seen something he hadn't noticed before. She wasn't happy. The expensive husband, the trips to the Maldives, the champagne, and the designer clothes. None of it had given her what she was looking for. She had torn him down because she needed to believe that leaving him had been the right choice. And the harder she tried to convince everyone else, the more obvious it became that she was really trying to convince herself. Henry didn't need to hate her for that. He could let it go. He thought about what Kara had said in the parking lot, about how sometimes you need someone else to speak for you. Not because you can't speak for yourself, but because the world won't listen when you do. She was right. He had spent his whole life being careful, being quiet, trying not to take up too much space. And where had it gotten him? Standing alone in a room full of people who had already decided who he was. But Carrara had changed the narrative. She had walked in and rewritten the story, not with anger or accusation, but with simple truth. And in doing so, she had shown Henry something he had forgotten. His worth wasn't determined by Ellie's words or the crowd's judgment. It was determined by his actions. Day after day, year after year, the choices he made when no one was watching, the promises he kept when it would have been easier to break them. He wasn't a failed husband. He was a man whose marriage had ended like millions of marriages end for reasons that were complicated and painful and ultimately nobody's business but his own. He wasn't a useless father. He was a single dad who had fought for custody of his daughter, who had rearranged his entire life around her needs, who had turned down a promotion because being present for her mattered more than any corner office. He wasn't weak for staying silent. He was strong enough to know that some battles aren't worth fighting, that some people aren't worth convincing, that the only opinion that truly mattered was the one belonging to a 7-year-old girl who fell asleep waiting for her daddy to come home. Henry put his phone away and walked to the small table by the door where he kept his keys and wallet. Next to them sat a framed photograph, him and Serena at the beach last summer, both of them laughing at something. The camera hadn't captured. He picked it up and studied it, remembering that day. Serena had spent hours building sand castles, and Henry had helped her dig a moat that kept filling with water. They had eaten ice cream for lunch and watched the sunset from the boardwalk. It had been a perfect day, the kind of day that made everything else worthwhile. That was who he was. Not the man Ellie described. Not the stereotype the world expected. Just a father who loved his daughter and tried his best every single day. He set the photograph down and headed to his bedroom. As he changed out of his suit and into comfortable clothes, he thought about tomorrow. There would be work and school drop-off and probably a dozen small crises that needed his attention. There would be questions from colleagues who had heard about the reunion and maybe some awkward conversations with people who didn't know what to say. Life would go on the way it always did. But something had shifted tonight, something fundamental. Henry had spent 3 years believing that he had to carry his burdens alone, that asking for help was weakness, that silence was the only safe response to a world that was always ready to judge him. Kara had shown him a different way. Not fighting, not fleeing, but simply standing firm in his own truth and letting someone else help him hold that ground. He lay down in bed and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow he would text Carrara and thank her properly. Maybe he would ask her to coffee as a friend, as a colleague, as whatever she wanted to be. He didn't know where that might lead, and he wasn't going to overthink it. For now, it was enough to know that she existed, that someone had seen him, truly seen him, and found him worthy. His phone buzzed one last time. Another message from Carrara. For what it's worth, I think your daughter already knows how lucky she is. Good night, Henry. He smiled and typed back. Good night, Carrara. Then he closed his eyes and for the first time in longer than he could remember, fell asleep without the weight of the world on his shoulders. Down the hall, Serena slept peacefully, dreaming whatever dream 7-year-olds dream, and in the quiet house, surrounded by the evidence of a life built on love and sacrifice and stubborn hope. Henry finally allowed himself to believe what he had always known, but never quite accepted. He was enough. He had always been enough. And now, at last, he could stop trying to prove it to anyone but himself. If this story touched your heart, you're not alone. Stories like Henry's remind us that our worth isn't defined by the loudest voices in the room, but by the quiet choices we make every day. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one, and leave a comment telling me what you think Henry should do next. Should he take that coffee with Carrara? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, take care of yourselves and the people who matter most.